Hi everyone and welcome to this video. Welcome back to the channel in general. As you know, on this channel we talk a lot about Jungian psychoanalysis and general perspectives in psychology going beyond Jungian psychoanalysis. Jungian psychoanalysis being the psychology proposed by Carl Jung, one of the students of Sigmund Freud, working on problems of the psyche, especially developing notions like the collective unconscious, the archetypes, and others around the turn of the 20th century. Now, today we'll go beyond Jung a little bit and talk about the problem of free will. Free will is something I've mentioned in many videos. I often said I don't believe in free will. I don't think free will exists to the extent we think it exists. Now, just to be clear, I do think free will exists on a day-to-day level. I can make a choice to pick up this book. I can make a choice to click a button, but and we can call that into question in other contexts as well. But I want to talk about two very fundamental conceptual points why on a larger scale free will doesn't really come into play. Now, one of these levels is the level of the ego, in which we crystallize or let's say assemble certain elements that we then crystallize and add into sort of a linear structure. And while these elements that we think are stable, we project to be stable, continue to develop. Now, this is the first level. The second level, conjuncted with that, is the problem of debt. Now, debt is essentially the dependence of certain interpretations. There's sort of the interdependence of interpretations of these elements. Now, the second proper level would be the level of the collective unconscious. Now, the collective unconscious is a concept that Jung proposed, where the archetypes function, as we'll come to see, as some trajectories along which we can situate precisely the elements we talked about in the first part of the video, the elements that the ego then crystallizes. And these trajectories also play upon these elements and sort of influence them, sort of scolding, if you will, the free will that we think we have. Now, after this, subsequent to this introduction, we'll talk about again, as I said, these elements in their crystallization a little bit. We'll talk about the problem of debt, and we'll go on to talk about the problem of the collective unconscious, to then end up with some concluding remarks and sort of how we can use this limitation of free will in everyday life, in our own psychological development. Now, just as a precursor before we go on to the rest of the video, please do consider to leave a comment below if you like this video. And if you like the content, then and you want to continue doing your own research and you need some advice on what to read in the Jungian context, then there you can find a link in the section below, in the description below, where you can answer a couple questions and you'll get an individualized reading list that I'll send to you on Jung and beyond. So that may be interesting for you. Also, go check out other videos and do consider to subscribe if you want. Now, let's get into the first part of this video. To understand sort of the problem of crystallization, we have to first understand the ego in general. Now, I make many videos on the ego. It's probably the topic I discuss most because I find it fascinating, but do go ahead and watch these videos if you want. I'll give you a brief overview now, but again, there's a lot more content on this where I talk about the ego in depth, and there's a playlist on the ego as well. Now, the ego essentially has the task within the psyche to create a coherent sense of who we are, who you are, who I am, And this coherent sense is created by taking elements that the ego encounters in reality, sort of outside of us, and crystallizing them, so making them permanent in order to align them into a coherent structure that it can then project into the future. This process is, let's say, repeated over and over again whenever we encounter new elements in order to fit the newly encountered material into this structure. The ego is thus sort of aims to achieve a coherent interpretation of reality as we encounter it, and attempts to make this interpretation timeless. So the ego attempts to create a space that is timeless, in the sense that it attempts to create a space in which its own interpretation is always correct. This attempt is, of course, we would say tyrannical because things change. And this is so the first instance where we see the problem of free will arise, because the ego thinks it has free will by sort of interpreting these elements the way it wants to. We can understand, the weather being rainy as good or bad. We can say, oh, well, it's beautiful, it's raining, it's wonderful. Or we can say, well, I love it. I'm sad it's raining, I'd love it to be sunny. We have a choice here, right? We think. But then there is sort of a consequence of this choice. We may say, oh, it's lovely, it's raining, it's wonderful, and then it continues raining so much that our house gets flooded, or that our dog drowns, whatever it is. So there's a consequence to the interpretation that we put forth, and now then the ego is faced with a choice. Either we adjust our interpretation and say, okay, well, actually, I don't like rain. There's this wonderful book by Astrid Lindgren. I'm not sure if this is popular and beyond Europe, but she writes children's books, and there's this story about on Madita and her sister, and sort of Madita says, oh, I love snow. I think it's Madita or her sister. One of the two says, they're like 10 years old and it's snowing, and they live in Sweden and it's all wonderful. And they say, I love snow. Snow's great. Snow's wonderful. And she says, and the sister says, oh, well, no, I like the first snow of the year best. All the other snow is kind of annoying. It gets too much. And the other girl says, oh, no, actually, I like all snow. All snow is amazing. I want to have all the snow in the world. And as the story unfolds, she goes on to sort of, do some stupid things. She jumps on the back of a sled. That some, stories set in the, back in the day where they would still use sleds to sort of carry goods. And she jumps on it's a horse carriage, I think, actually. She jumps on the back of this horse carriage, and sort of just to sort of show off to one of her classmates, some boy who did the same thing and rode on the back of the horse carriage illegally through town, and so she does the same, which is an act of hubris, because on two levels, right? On the first level, she doesn't. Why does she have to impress this boy, which is first of all a boy, and secondly is like, I think, twice her age probably. She's like 5 and he's 10. So why does she have to do that? Well, it's an act of hubris. She wants to impress him. Obviously, she wants to prove to him, I can do this as well. And Lindgren always writes these characters. She always writes these characters, especially girls that want to say, oh no, I can do this as well. She has many of these characters in her stories, in her books. But so essentially, that's the first level of hubris. But the second level of hubris unfolds in relation to this love of snow, where she's mesmerized by the beauty of the town and everything, and the snow is so beautiful throughout the first half of the story. And then as she jumps on the back of this carriage, the man, she can't jump off. She can't she can't turn around. She can't escape her own hubris anymore. The catastrophe unfolds, as it were, right? And the man goes deeper and deeper into the forest, and she doesn't know where they're going. She's lost. It continues to snow, and at some point he starts drinking whiskey from a bottle and sing, terrifying songs to a 4-year-old girl or 5-year-old girl, or however, maybe she's 6, I don't know, but certainly quite young. And he sings these horrible songs, and she's terrified, and at some point she just jumps off the carriage, where she tells the guy, oh, stop, you have to bring me back home. And she was like, I don't have to do shit, I'll just I'll go my own way. And so she just essentially is left in the forest, and because she's left in the forest, she experiences sort of the full reality of what she said previously, namely that she loves all the snow. Now, essentially what happens here is that she created an element in her ego, which is all snow is great. She's crystallized this element at a younger age, probably, experiencing the greatness of the snow within the protective realm of her parents and her home and so on. And now she's experiencing sort of the raw nature of it. And in this context, she comes to say at some point in the story that actually I hate all snow. all snow is bad, it's terrible. And she returns home, after all, you know, with an appreciation and a healthy fear of the snow, and also a sort of a reservation saying towards her sister, there's this whole notion that she's been, you know, a bit mean to her sister and so on, because she's been, her sister had a fever and she had the chance to go shopping alone. In the context of this going shopping alone, she then experienced this catastrophe. And Christmas shopping, that is, by the way. And so she reconciles with her sister. So you see here, so almost sort of the hero's journey echoed, right? You see this catastrophe, you see the hubris preceding the catastrophe, and you see subsequent to this catastrophe, you see a sort of a coming to terms with the sort of the problematic aspects of this hubris, and, you know, uniting in a sort of let's say, you know, comforting way, in a way, you know, coming to terms with wisdom. And exactly what we see here, this crystallization couldn't hold, because the snow is more than that which the ego thought it was. The ego always has sort of this limited perspective upon the world, upon reality, and precisely these limited perspectives hits its limits once it encounters the actual development of the reality. Now, this gets even more dramatic, or we can problematize this further when we talk about the problem of debt. Now, debt, I say, is that which we owe the positive indexing of a certain element into the ego to. Now, what this exactly means is basically you have, whenever you add an element to the ego, to the structure of the ego, you have a source of this element, which is, you know, maybe your wife telling you, I'll always be faithful. Now, the source of the element, my wife will always be faithful, sort of this crystallization of your wife as a faithful person in your ego, is installed in this moment on the one hand, but then also goes back. It has a history. It references other elements within the ego. Perhaps your mother has been faithful to your dad, or so you thought. Now, just to take a simple example, you have your mother and your wife as two sources of this sort of debt, of a debt that emerges in the moment where this element is crystallized, is added to your ego, and then projected as stability into the future. Now, you don't know what faithful means. You don't know what I will means. You don't know what I means. You don't know what always means. Like, you don't know any of these. Like, there's so many insecurities within this statement that would not allow you to add this ego by your free will, apparently, into its linearity to sort of project into the future a certain stability that it attempts to maintain. Now, the problem is that once you find out that any of these instances is not true, let's say your mother has been cheating on your father, let's say your wife and continues to cheat on you, any of these, or not be faithful for that matter, any of these elements will create a rupture, or what Jung would call it ego death, on this sort of micro level. Now, depending on how fundamental this element is to the entire structure of the ego, because you have to imagine the ego, right, is this web where many elements are interpreted, and some of them are fundamental, some of them aren't. But once this is, let's say once an element is fundamental, there will be a potential crumbling of the entire structure. The structure will break down in its entirety, potentially. Now, the importance of debt, I think, is highlighted because it highlights or foregrounds the interdependence of people, because you don't know why you think something. Like, you have no clue. Do you think it because your wife told you she's faithful? Do you think it because you saw in movies that faithfulness exists? Like, once you start really pondering upon the origin of certain elements, certain signifiers that are sort of wrapped into this chain, you can't really go back. You know, you can't really return. There's no way to come back to sort of a concluding point where you can point towards an actual starting point of the debt that you owe. The debt ultimately is infinite. And now we get to the question, of course, the question of objectivity, the question, okay, well then, what do we know actually is free will, right? And how do we know there's anything determining if it's all based on this infinite vortex of debt that we owe? and then they owe debt and they owe debt again. So we're all indebted with each other. And then the question becomes, okay, where does objectivity come into play? The question of objectivity is answered in Jung in the collective unconscious. And the collective unconscious, as a reminder, is the underlying sort of fundament of all reality, psychic and physical, for Jung. Now, what that means is the collective unconscious is a layer below the personal unconscious. It is a layer split off from the personal psyche that the personal psyche is born into. It unfolds into this, the personal element of the personal psyche, unfolds into or along the trajectories, as Jung puts it, of this collective unconscious. Now, the trajectories of the collective unconscious are what Jung refers to as the archetypes. They are essentially the complexes, the core, the nuclei around which the elements of the ego, the elements that we just referred to, can cluster. This process of clustering is, fundamentally speaking, a process by which the elements that we voluntarily, so to speak, encounter are grouped into meaningful relations. So this is basically the process of grouping the mother that told you I'll be faithful with the wife that told you I'll be faithful around a shared core, a shared nucleus. And this shared nucleus, and that's important, is an objective nucleus that you, let's say you're born into, you inherited, not so much from your parents as an inherited structure, but you're born into it. It's a structure that pre-exists in reality, in the sort of surroundings, within us and the world. You may ask, why does the chicken lay its egg or build its nest in the hedge? Well, sorry, not the chicken. Why does the bird build its nest in the hedge? Of course, because of the hedge, because the hedge is the best place, or because it inherited this instinct to build it. Well, I think it's an interaction. It's the hedge is the perfect place and has always been the perfect place, and the chicken always built its nest here, so it inherited it. It's an instinctual behavior. Now, the same, I think, goes for this for these objective cores. There is a certain instinct to behave towards a mother, towards a spouse in a certain way. That's what we've always been doing. And there's many more material I recorded on the collective unconscious, so please look at that. But the problem of free will emerges here because there's something preceding us that we cannot control, something that we can exercise influence upon by by way of developing or continuing to develop the archetypes, but we cannot control them. And I think the importance here is to recognize this something that's bigger than us. And now in the concluding remarks, what I would like to say is that the lack of free will on these two levels is a chance, because we can, first of all, you can see where you originate, you can see where you are, and that is, you're spread out over space and in space and time. You're spread out into the past by virtue of the collective unconscious. You're spread out in space by virtue of being collected by debt to all other subjects and places and so on and so forth. And you can start recognizing yourself within these structures. You can start looking for yourself, again, in these interactions with people where you see, oh, actually, my image of truth, my image of faithfulness originates precisely here. And where else does it originate? And then you can go down and start reflecting. And you can do this in conjunction with others that you're close to, and in conjunction with the world. All right, I think that's it for now. Let's try to keep it under 20 minutes. Like always, thank you for watching, and I do hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please give it a thumbs up and consider to subscribe. And again, if you have any thoughts, remarks, or requests for future videos, do leave a comment below. Thanks a lot.